All right, welcome in everyone to this edition of Wave Extra. I'm your anchor, Jose Sosaya, going through another day of perhaps the most high-profile story we've been covering for you since the week started. Obviously, a short week given it was Memorial Day, but the attention hasn't gone anywhere because we're talking about the first of what promises to be some pretty high-profile trials. The one in question relating, of course, to Crystal Rogers, her disappearing 10 years ago, but for an entire community feeling like it's still very fresh as a wound. And the question here being for the man that prosecutors have brought up for this trial is Stephen Lawson. So perhaps the million-dollar question for a lot of us as we move around and think about all the coverage that is, driven this attention, we're wondering, did Stephen Lawson, that's the question prosecutors are trying to answer, did Stephen Lawson actively participate in the disappearance and what we presume is the murder of Crystal Rogers way back when? Now, the defense hasn't switched from its position as far as saying that he's only tampered with evidence. That's the case they're making. The jury's going to have to make, that choice, the decision when the time comes to render a verdict. But witnesses on the stand, and plenty of witnesses took the stand today, and some of them are suggesting he actually did a lot more than that. Wave News reporter Alina Noakes has been in Warren County as part of our coverage team, and she has the latest from Bowling Green on day 2 of the trial.
Well, this case is moving fairly quickly through trial, even with the explosive testimony that we have managed to hear today from a total of 8 witnesses. One of those coming in the last hour. That's with Steve Lawson's grand jury testimonies. And we do use plural testimonies because he did manage to have more than one, which is not typical in cases when prosecutors are trying to achieve an indictment. We've heard a lot of details from many of his grand juries before, but the most interesting and new detail we heard today from a grand jury testimony is when he admitted to having set up a, quote, code word with Brooks Houck to know when to talk about rental properties. And that's what Lawson says that 13-second phone call to Houck around midnight on the last day Crystal was seen alive, that's July 3rd, was about. It's unclear what that code word might be. We heard from a total of 8 witnesses today. A total of 10 have been heard so far in this trial. Testimony ranged from allegations of things Lawson had said or done implicating him in Crystal's disappearance to deleted phone calls to many of the people police believe to be involved in this case. Now, we do expect the prosecution to wrap up their case by lunch tomorrow. The case would then move over to the defense. We don't yet know if the defense plans to call any witnesses on their side of this case.
All right, so you heard from Alina right there, sort of the big points and takeaways as we're going to set up some video here. But in essence, again, reminding you the plethora of witnesses they're bringing up to the stand, the prosecution trying to make its case for what is involved. I want to play this for you right now. This is a sketch courtesy of Sydney Young. Just one of the witnesses brought up there is Detective John Snow providing some of that expert testimony. We know there are others who have several different connections to the Lawsons. Remember, this is Stephen Lawson, the father, Joseph Lawson, the son, who Joseph is going to be tried alongside Brooks Houck. That is Crystal Rogers' then boyfriend at the time that she disappeared. So a lot of intriguing parts, connections that we're all going to dive into. A reminder, of course, be sure to keep up with our daily coverage of these trials and sort of the testimony that we're all looking at there. Is Steve Lawson going to take the stand? Who might the defense bring up whenever prosecution does decide to rest? So again, we're going to update all these big developments through our app. A reminder that is free to download on your app store. It's over the air, of course. We're working, morning, noon, and night here on Wave News. And of course, we always share those updates on our website, wave3.com. Right now, what I want to set up for you is a conversation I had earlier today with our Wave legal analyst, Leland Hulbert. Leland has, a wealth of experience working as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney. So invaluable insight. And, he's following this trial like many of us. Unfortunately, we don't have the cameras in court to listen to the testimony, to see how the witnesses are behaving on the stand, the tone in which prosecutors and the defense attorneys are engaging in conversation with the witnesses. We're relying on sort of all the reports from our reporters like Alina, our producers who are there in the courtroom in Bowling Green. But we still have something to go forward with and look ahead to for tomorrow and day 3 at least. So why don't we get to the first part of my conversation with Wave legal analyst Leland Hulbert. All right, folks, welcome back to another bit of Wave Extra. Checking in with Leland Hulbert, our legal analyst. Leland, thanks for coming back on. Day 2 for Stephen Lawson's particular trial. I've got some notes in front of me that I'll ask some questions to you, but just take me through what stood out to you about what you were able to absorb from the testimony today.
Well, obviously, like everyone else, I haven't watched anything, and I've just read some notes. I think that the trial is going quickly. There's a lot of witnesses being run through by both sides, and I don't know if the cross-examination is short or if the prosecution is short. But typically, you know, you have 3 or 4 witnesses a day in a trial, and when they're big witnesses, you have 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. And it seems like there's a pretty good amount of quality witnesses, or at least that may have potential information. So it's going how you would expect it, with pointing out the weaknesses and the credibility of the witnesses. If there's drug use, if there's tax problems, if there's, you know, whatever they're claiming, that's one tactic. But you also, it's hard to tell with just from notes about how much are they hitting what they actually said. Like, do you remember, where did you say this? When did you say this? Why did you say this? I think they're getting to the point of possible favoritism and possible affiliations with the family, because everybody seems kind of interrelated here. And there's also, you know, women's daughters dating the same people. You know, it's an interesting case. And there's also drug use and things like that. So the defense is poking small holes, but it looks like some of the statements these people say they remember could be large.
So that carries the weight to it. And to your point about perhaps the quality of witnesses, if you're thinking the number was 3 or 4 the prosecution could bring up, they bring a lot to the case. Does it strike you as, you know, out of the usual that I think we counted, based on the notes we were getting back, that we were counting 9-10 witnesses that the prosecution's called so far? Does that stand out to you at all, the number?
In a case that's been investigated for 10 years and there's been tons of statements and tons of research and tons of, I don't want to say evidence, but attempts to get evidence, it doesn't surprise me there's a lot of witnesses. It surprised me that they've gotten through 10 in a day and a half or 2 days. And that can be for a variety of reasons. I don't think it's really a sign of, is this favoring the defense or favoring the prosecution? It's just it seems a high volume. I mean, everybody remembers the old enough, remembers the OJ trial that took 10 months or however long it took, with a large number of witnesses, but they would take days and days and days. And here they're taking an hour or less, which is not abnormal, but it's fast.
Okay. I wanted to talk to you about perhaps some of what some particular witnesses, if you remember the name of Detective Snow, was someone who I think they brought back for this next day, the second day. There were some questions he was being asked about a hairbrush and some samples, perhaps, that those weren't, the defense asking why those weren't tested. His testimony was they didn't want to run the risk of destroying them. So what does that tell you as far as the theme or the point the defense in that question is trying to make to the jury, perhaps?
Well, jurors are conditioned, and people are conditioned, like, to believe CSI is real and that everything and anything should be tested. But if you're a defense attorney, you absolutely point out what hasn't been tested, and especially in a case without a body and without, it's not on video, it's not in front of 100 people. No one seems to know exactly what happened, including the prosecution. So if you have hairs, which are commonly known to have DNA, genetic coding, why they weren't tested, it doesn't seem like a great answer. The fact that they may be destroyed is not an answer I think is good enough. Mm-hmm. But it depends on what was tested. And if they were believed, they did some my understanding is that it's a minor testing on them, not DNA testing. If they came back to match Crystal Rogers, well, it's her hairbrush, presumably. Could it be somebody else? I mean, hindsight's always 2020. And 10 years ago, the defenses in both trials are going to have plenty of, well, why didn't you do this? Why did you say this? How has this changed? That seems to be the theme of their defense. And trying to act like the police didn't do everything they should, that's argued in virtually every criminal trial I've ever seen.
All right, so perhaps nothing out of the ordinary in that sense. What stuck out to me as I was coming into work today, remembering our conversation yesterday about good attorneys will drive the themes home. Not that it's the central theme, perhaps, with the witnesses we're discussing, but I wanted to start with, for example, your point, a lot of family intrigue. There's Lauren Harden, who we found out her mom is Tammy Lawson, so Stephen Lawson's wife. We'll get into the other witnesses, but perhaps that opens the question to, Joseph Lawson, who the mother of his child is. I can get to the next character we're going to discuss, but the choice in talking about drug use for these specific witnesses, as if to say that compromise their memory, does that make sense to you as a theme tactic?
The key word with any witness is, unless they're an expert witness, is, and even with an expert, is credibility. Are these witnesses credible? So if you're pointing, they'll hear a story from the witness because the prosecution goes first. And the prosecution story is usually pretty good. Sometimes it's a prosecutor technique to bring out the bad stuff so the defense doesn't have that got you moment. But when you find out the person was on meth or having money problems, then all of a sudden, for better or for worse, or even if it's justified, that will sit in a juror's brain. Now, is it enough to make the witness completely unbelievable? That depends. That's up to a juror's interpretation. But, how do they present today? Do they still present like they may have a drug issue, or is it something they dealt with in the past? Can they talk intelligently about recovery, or is it something they're trying to hide? I mean, as far as a witness, you want credible and you want truthful. And the best witnesses will talk about the downsides and the bad things because they will be honest about everything, or at least a jury will perceive they're being. And when they start hiding things, defense would likely say, well, you're hiding this, maybe you're hiding evidence, or maybe you've changed your story, So I think it's those holes are fairly poked. It's good strategy.
For sure. There was another strategy with this witness, Elizabeth Chesser, who I mentioned has a child with Joseph, who is, obviously there's so many connection points with, this is Stephen. Joseph, we're talking about his son, which his trial's coming up a little bit later. There was a question about loyalty regarding Crystal Rogers' mom, if that was something, again, that makes sense to you if you're a defense attorney, if your motivation to come to the stand is for some reason for, a woman like Sherry Ballard, who was the first witness the prosecution called up in this trial.
Well, I think if I read the notes correctly, that there was an issue where Sherry Ballard went up to, I don't know, it was Elizabeth Chesser maybe? Or
yes, it was Elizabeth Chesser asking when they talked, and she says they talked during a brief break that happened during testimony. She is still under sequester. So those were the notes that we were to get from our team out there.
Yeah, so I mean, that would be, and I heard that the defense attorneys jumped up and down. I don't blame them. I mean, if you're talking to a witness while they're testifying during a break, that is massive. My impression was it may have been after her testimony at a normal court break. And she said something to the effect that I hope this helps you, or hope this helps heal, or something like that. And that's strange. I mean, yes. You don't want that. The prosecution wants as clean a case as possible. And even if the defense attorney can't get that testimony stricken, they still get it out there that there's some collusion, or they know each other, or they may be trying to help each other. So it's just another nugget that the jury considers when they sit back there with their 500 nuggets to figure out whether this person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
I want to read you the quote, at least based on what the team was able to get from us. It's, quote, "I pray this brings you peace, but I don't know that it will." So on the surface, doesn't necessarily hint at anything beyond just someone's well wishes. But if you're the prosecution, that doesn't necessarily, you necessarily don't want to give the appearance of that kind of moment for them to have that conversation.
No, you want each witness to be independent and believable. And the more that there is collusion, the more problems you have. But like you said, the jury could read it that she's offering her honest, heartfelt sympathy for someone who lost a daughter. So it could cut both ways.
We just heard from our Wave legal analyst, Leland Hulbert, there, part one of our conversation, again, touching on those points, perhaps that he was surprised at the speed of the testimony we've seen, heard from the witnesses, how the prosecution is moving, to the point of witness credibility. And there was, again, that recurring theme with certain people in Stephen Lawson's life, but perhaps the defense trying to answer or try to get to those points of the witnesses, their choices way back then, if that compromised their ability to remember the series of events that ultimately led to Crystal Rogers disappearing. So again, fascinating stuff in a conversation that we know will keep going as the trial moves forward into whatever the stage is, with the last set of witnesses for the prosecution, whatever the defense tries to argue with their experts that are coming up. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Just for the moment, if we can, I'm going to set up a quick commercial break. So we'll be right back, and we'll have the next part of my conversation with Wave legal analyst Leland Hulbert. So stay put. All right, everyone, welcome back. Wave Extra, day 2 of Stephen Lawson's trial. Thanks for joining us again. Jose Sosaya breaking down all these extra conversations and updates from our team down in Bowling Green and Warren County as they're following every last update of the trial, offering our expert legal analyst from attorney Leland Hulbert. Again, the central question driving at least this particular trial with this particular defendant is, did Stephen Lawson, who we know had a working relationship with Brooks Houck, did he actively participate in disappearing Crystal Rogers, who we presume was murdered back in 2015? So again, the defense coming into today, even from opening arguments, not suggesting that he didn't tamper with evidence. They're not disputing perhaps that argument the prosecutors are trying to make for that particular charge. But again, trying to defend their client when it comes to the much more serious charge with complicity. And witnesses, again, offering their testimony. We're talking about expert analysis with cell phone data, recollection of relationships. Again, that's something we'll keep following as the story plays out. What I want to play for you now is part 2 of my conversation earlier with our Wave legal analyst, Leland Hulbert, and sort of expecting or thinking about what to expect as the prosecution presumably wraps up their arguments and cedes the floor to the defense. And perhaps what, someone with years of experience in the legal field, he will try to glom onto as, again, we wait to see what comes up next in testimony. What are the arguments the defense is going to make? So let's play the next part of my conversation with Leland Hulbert for you coming up here. I want to go back to, if you've heard conversations or subjects on July 3rd of 15, and it seems to be a lot of centering around a phone call that was made that day. A lot of notes coming in on that, but it seems where both sides are trying to lay out as far as cell tower stuff is concerned. I'll get to that in a bit. There's an interesting witness that was called up. I believe his name is Charlie Girdley. They were discussing him. It seems he worked with the Lawsons and has a connection to Hauk. So for the prosecution to bring up someone like him, especially when they say, I'm reading through the notes here, he remembers going to Hauk's house with Joseph and picking up the keys to Crystal's car. There was also a point that there's a discussion and a question he was asked about Steve and Hauk having a conversation about getting rid of your old woman or whatever.
Right.
And the deflection, it seems, was to say Steve Lawson, based on the witness testimony, is like, don't talk to me about that. Talk to this guy who the prosecution brought up on the stand. So again, there may be time for us to better dissect all of that, but how interesting is it to you to say, here's someone who can attest to, whatever the defense is going to try and say, but someone who had knowledge of potentially some conversations leading up to or before Crystal Rogers disappeared?
Well, what's the most important timeline in any case is around the time of the murder itself. And July 3rd, July 4th, July 5th of 2015 should be the most important 3 dates to the jury, or, that time period, that range. That is something the jury is going to want to know exactly what happened. And of course, you never know what happened exactly. And it's 10 years ago. So the more pieces of the puzzle they can put together. I mean, when I have a client as a defense attorney, the first thing I ask them is, send me a timeline in your own words. Let me know what happened. And that's how I learn about a case. When I was a prosecutor, I asked the lead detective, give me a timeline. They give their investigative notes and they go in date and time order. So it's how people process information. It's how you tell a story. So both sides are trying to tell a story that each side wants the jury to believe, and you start a story typically chronologically. So that time period, those days are going to be examined by a microscope with the jury. The question is, how small are the pieces under that microscope? How much information are they looking at?
And one other thing I wanted to ask you about is, this feels like a much more pertinent conversation in our modern world, with us having these things right here with us, presumably all the time, but it seems like that was the case even back in 2015. There was a large chunk of time spent with the digital analysts, I think the witnesses they brought up, and the discussion around what you can track on someone's phone based on, is the tower, are you looking for the signal at the best tower, or is that based on, the tower that verifies where you actually were at any given time? So to your point about establishing a timeline of movement, what do you think the prosecution and or the defense is going to want to establish when it comes to any phone data regarding, because it sounds like we've been talking about that phone call, but presumably there were text messages and a whole bunch of other people interacting with each other at that time.
So phones now in our society, and especially in criminal cases, are extremely important. And I think people generally believe the location data. And defense attorneys can point out that it's not perfect and that there are issues with the pings and the satellites and the towers and which tower and which network. And some people use each other's networks and things like that. But generally speaking, they're going to likely believe that roadmap if the detective or the forensic investigator does a good job of laying it out. And if that information hurts the defendant, defense attorney can only do so much to downplay GPS and geographical information, because presumably there's some sort of map or something that the prosecution has put together to show where they were and how they came together and if they were together. And then you pair that with the evidence of someone saying, yeah, we met that night, or no, we didn't meet that night. And it can show if someone's lying. It can show who's close in time to a scene. And it's a massive improvement for detectives in the last 30 years that well, maybe 10 or 20 years. But, any increase in technology is typically going to help the defendant, the prosecution. But what it helps is, what you hope is to get to the truth of the matter.
For sure.
So, I've had other cases when I was a prosecutor where we looked at location data presented by the police or even a defense attorney and said, yeah, this wasn't them. They didn't do this. Now, cell phones can be manipulated, but 10 years ago, the technology was less. So that's my guess is what they're getting into, like how it's different then and now, some limitations they had in 2015 on pings and GPS and things like that. But obviously that technology existed.
Okay. I'll circle back to something you sort of observed is perhaps the speed at which both sides are talking to the witnesses they're bringing up. Based on the notes, I don't have these printed, but we've been getting them from our team all day. Their impression is they think the prosecution might rest by lunchtime tomorrow. Does that, you've been in all types of, timelines for trials. Does that strike you as particularly speedy on the prosecution's part, that they think that they can wrap up by, Thursday early afternoon?
Yes. I think there was kind of a false presumption by me and many people that a murder case that's 10 years old, that the country's watching, or at least has a lot of interest and has already had a documentary and everything else, would be long and drawn out. Your typical murder case, that's really hard to say, would be probably 2 weeks. And your typical high profile case would be probably 3 weeks to 3 months. So the fact that they're getting this done in 3 days, it's fast, but maybe it could be explained by the prosecution asking simple questions and not seeking more information, the defense feeling like they're getting what they wanted, and the judge moving things along. So I can't really tell you who it favors. I can tell you that it does appear to be fast.
And there's no reason to, connect the same pace at which the prosecution is moving to say the defense could. They certainly could move at the same or similar pace, but is there any reason to believe that, more witnesses or more time spent on questions might give them more time to make their argument to the jury?
Well, I think I said this in an earlier interview. When they're not your witness, you don't know what they're going to say necessarily. And some people have given statements, and you can cross-examine them if they lie or things like that. But you typically don't want to ask too many questions as an attorney that you don't know the answer to. And these are all prosecution witnesses, so you're not going to know many answers as you would if you're calling the witnesses. So a lot of these are just people that are trying to remember things from 10 years ago. So in my opinion, the defense attorneys, you see them on TV, the ones that love to scream and yell and pull their hair out, but that doesn't always go well with innocent witnesses. If you're cross-examining an officer, sometimes you can be more forceful because people sometimes wonder if officers are doing the right thing. With a witness, you start attacking witnesses, well, you're attacking a mother, you're attacking a sister, you're attacking somebody who's lost a relative. And so you have to be careful, and you have to do it intelligently and not just bullying the witnesses. And my guess is, with the speed of these, that's their tactic, is less is more.
And one more thing for you, Leland, before I go. No reason to predict or assume the defense would bring Mr. Lawson up to the stand. Obviously, that's his or their call. But
That's always the $1 million question, and usually the $1 million answer is don't do it as a defense attorney. I mean, I think it's fair to say the jurors want to hear from him, and there'll be some jurors that say, well, if he didn't testify, maybe he did something wrong. What's he hiding? But there have been plenty of people acquitted that never testified. And that's one of the main staples of the Constitution, is your right to remain silent. Now, my understanding is this defendant has given multiple statements in the past. Some are admissible, some are not. And he could clear up some things, but he's opening himself up to a cross-examination by an expert. Yeah. Now, the prosecution's an expert. He's been doing this a long time. So there are pitfalls, but generally speaking, I mean, I've had cases, most defense attorneys have had cases where they thought, well, he really wants to testify. I like him. He seems honest. Let's see how it goes. And it never goes as well as you think it's going to go, even if you've got what you believe is an innocent client. So I would say the odds of him testifying are probably 100 to 1, but it's possible.
All right. Well, certainly time will tell for us if that happens. Well, we don't assume he'd be among the first defense witnesses called, and I'm sure they have their staple. And do you think in a case like this, and I promise I'll let you go after this question, Leland, an emphasis on experts that would establish, possible circumstances for him? You think experts would be in the defense's corner to explain the bits of evidence and situation?
Yeah, I would have to know probably a little more about the case. But typically a jury trusts an expert if they're qualified. And I could see them calling an expert in memory and how people's memories fade and change. You could theoretically call a medical professional to say how meth or cocaine affects your memory or recollection or your ability to perceive. You could also call a DNA expert or a former detective to say, would you have tested hair if you found hair? So I can't predict. I haven't talked to them. I don't know what their strategy is, but those could be some possible ideas, because if you're refuting experts with your own experts, they go last. Now, theoretically, the prosecutor could recall an expert to clean up some things, but it really will be determined on how long a case they could present. I mean, I've seen defenses be no witnesses, and your whole theory is they didn't prove it. They proved tampering because they're saying they tampered.
And it sounds like they're
kind of falling on that sword pretty quickly, which is strategic. You want to avoid the guillotine and fall on the sword. So we'll see what happens.
Okay. Excellent breakdown. Thank you, Leland Hulbert, our Wave legal analyst. Again, thanks for joining us on Wave Extra Day 2 breakdown of Stephen Lawson's trial, heading into Day 3 for whenever the defense comes up to call up their witnesses and see where things move forward from there. Leland, appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
A reminder for folks still tuning in, thanks for sticking with us on Wave Extra, on Wave Now, and all our social media platforms. We do have many more updates, a pretty comprehensive blog on wave3.com. You can see, of course, the title of the headline. Day 2 of Stephen Lawson's trial wrapping up after, again, multiple witness testifying of the kind who know or worked or have relationships with Stephen Lawson, those who were involved in the initial investigation into Crystal Rogers after she disappeared. Again, you can get your recap, a pretty good image of what's going on in the courtroom, thanks to our sketch artists, the multiple witnesses, and the stories they are telling the jury as they, mull over all of the evidence and the testimony that will be before them. So if we can come back to here in the studio. Takeaway for me, perhaps, when you heard that part of my conversation with Leland, the $1 million question that would merit $1 million answer is Stephen Lawson going to talk? Perhaps, in his expert opinion, he would advise, he has the right to remain silent, as is his constitutional right. There have been cases where defendants have wanted to offer the jury and reestablish, their innocence or their alibis. To the point that Leland was making about the two charges we're discussing in Stephen Lawson's case, where you're talking about the tampering with evidence and the complicity, the tie that goes with, the presumed murder of Crystal Rogers there. The metaphor perhaps is, avoid the guillotine and fall on the sword there, for which of those charges would carry a lesser penalty when it comes to Stephen Lawson. Time will tell on that front. So again, we'll keep following as we prepare for day 3 tomorrow. Our team staying in Bowling Green to get you all those latest updates. We're providing them day in, day night. A reminder for you all of where else and all the places you can get these updates on Stephen Lawson's trial. It's daily coverage, morning, noon, and night here on Wave News. Our app, free to download on your iPhone, your Android. We have it here on Wave Now, all of our OTT platforms, of course, on our website, wave3.com. Stick around. We're going to do a little preview for what to expect from our team working the night shift for Wave News at 11. So we'll have a little preview on that part. Hope you stick around. We'll be right back. Thanks again for sticking with us, everyone. It is 8:43 on your Wednesday evening. Thanks again. I'm Jose Sosaya with Wave News, with this Wave Extra update, focusing mainly on day 2, all of the interesting tidbits from Stephen Lawson's trial, the case revolving around Crystal Rogers' presumed murder and disappearance. Fascinating testimony we've been hearing. Our team of, reporters, expert, taking in all that testimony and information inside of the courtroom. They're staying pat, spending the night in Bowling Green up until we know what the outcome of this trial is, what the jury renders as a verdict for Stephen Lawson. So much more to get to on that. We'll, of course, follow that and follow the through lines as you stay with us if you're tuning in later tonight for Wave News at 11. One thing we did want to let you know we're working on as a team, we're following perhaps an issue, especially folks in Jefferson County. A lot of you, you'll follow this closely in the sense that everyone's watching out for their pocketbooks, budgeting as best as they can. And this is an issue, a conversation around utility bills. The reason I say that is for those who are MSD customers, an update for you all is we know that the MSD board recently, they approved what's called a preliminary request. And all this is to say they're looking at increasing rates for wastewater and drainage services, at least for Jefferson County. So the There will now be a 30-day comment period, and the board is going to vote on a final rate resolution. That is the goal when it comes to that. The rates taking effect August 1st. If the vote on the final rate resolution is done July 28th. So again, what we're discussing as far as an increase, the dollars amount that would impact you is a 4.9% increase for wastewater services in Jefferson County. If that's approved, in theory, your monthly bill would then go up by almost $4. So $391 is the math that was done here. So tonight, you will hear from MSD CEO. The argument MSD making for the increases is this is going to help them fund their maintenance work, management, growing Louisville's water systems. So this is part of our reporter's conversation with MSD. If you could play that right here.
I think folks need to understand that, particularly with our flood protection system, for example, any catastrophic failure of that system would be devastating not only to residents, but to our central business district, to our airport, to our traffic systems. And so the value add to making sure that these systems are working is something that I think is beneficial to everyone.
So there you're hearing the argument in just one part of our conversation with MSD's CEO when it comes to considering these rate increases. By the way, Wave News earlier today, we did also talk to customers, try to get their thoughts, and we're going to have much more tonight on how the public is going to be able to give their thoughts before there's a final decision, July 28th. Again, that is the date that a lot of folks might mark on their calendars if they're hoping to share their 2 cents on MSD's decision to increase their rates for wastewater and drainage services. So make sure to join us for Wave News at 11 tonight. Again, much more when it comes to all the Wave extra segments we will do to cover Stephen Lawson's trial whenever the prosecution decides to rest and the defense starts to build its case on behalf of Stephen Lawson. Of course, we will be there in Bowling Green for when the verdict comes down and following through on that case whenever we know about a sentencing date. And of course, then the dates after as we move through June for when Stephen Lawson's son Joseph and Brooks Houck, who is the boyfriend of Crystal Rogers at the time she disappeared, a very high profile character in the narrative and the story for this, when they're both going to go on trial. So thanks again for joining us for this update on Wave Extra. Again, you can always follow those updates and get the latest information from us on all the different platforms, online, social media, right here, and of course on Wave News itself. Appreciate you joining us. Have a good night.